This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight is John Helmer, and Dimitri Lascaris was going to join us, but I think I made a mistake on the time conversion difference between Russia and where Dimitri is in Montreal. So he may or may not join us. But John, I'm very happy to see you again and have you back on the show. There's just a couple of what I think are really big things that are happening today in the world, and they all revolve around Donald Trump. But he has been threatening to take Greenland and make it a part of the United States. Now, this has got a number of people in the European Union very upset with this. Trump is not happy with the fact that they're not supporting him, and he's threatening them again with something like 25% increase in tariffs. And at the same time, the Canadians and their Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is obviously not in favor of the United States taking back Greenland, but he's not very happy about Trump saying Canada could become the 51st state. Well, he has just finalized some major trade agreements with Russia and China. So, John, you have been very familiar with the reaction of not only Russia and China, but the Europeans. What are your thoughts on really what is going on, but also Russia? How will Russia or must Russia respond to this?
Thank you for having me back, Regis. And these are pressing questions. Let me try to put them in the context in which they are viewed in Moscow, as well as in the rest of the world, as our audience wants to understand and discuss. The Davos setting symbolizes very obviously and reflects the war between the capital resources of the sides at war on the Ukrainian battlefield. That's US and European capital versus Russian capital, Russian, Chinese, Indian capital on the other side. Inside the capital war, you have the representative of Russian capital, Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, in Davos this week to negotiate terms of settlement of war, peace terms so-called, with the representatives of U.S. capital, Stephen Witkoff, Jared Kushner. This is the context in which to understand Greenland. Greenland is a small but important part of the sea war against Russia, the war to destroy Russia, first by the methods that were used during the Yeltsin period, draw out its capital, draw out its oligarch and business class, and make them directly subservient to the United States and its ambition to be the sole hegemon, the dominant imperial power of the world. The sea war we've talked about, it's underway at the moment. It's to implement by military means, by boarding tankers, destroying vessels, to implement the sanctions war that both Europe and the United States pursue, to prevent Russia trading its principal oil and other commodities to the rest of the world. That's divided the fleets of the world, roughly speaking, 1,500 Russian or Shadow or Phantom or Black fleet versus about 1,500 in the top 10 commercial fleet that's controlled from Norway, from the United States, from Piraeus, Greece, and also from Denmark. And in that world, there's been considerable coordination between the United States, the British, The Danes are the most hostile population in Europe, as you understand, towards Russia. They've wanted war with Russia more passionately at the mass level than most Europeans. So what they're getting now is what they deserve. They didn't understand that war's coming because they wanted it. Now they do. Why does President Trump want Greenland, as his predecessors have long wanted? And why does he want it in a hurry? And why does he want to control the land to defend against Russia and China? Well, the answer is very simple. The United States aims to deprive Russia of the northern route, as it's called in Russian, or the Arctic route, which is the Sino-Russian, Russian-Indian, Russia to the world alternative to the Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz, to the Straits of Gibraltar, to the Danish Straits. This is the alternative to trading with the rest of the world more directly under Russian protection than the US can field at the moment, or the US and the Scandinavian states and Canada can defend or attack. So Greenland as a base for attacking and destroying Russian advantage in the Arctic, that's the reason. That's the strategic reason. Yes, I've seen interesting analysis, particularly in part of nakedcapitalism.com, if folks want to look it up, indicating that some of the powerful Silicon Valley constituents of Donald Trump want Greenland as a base for major AI and energy-related investment, as a sort of beyond regulation site for their economic development, as well as the mineral resource development of the Greenland. There is a constituency inside Trump's administration that want Greenland badly for their reasons, the strategic reasons I've just explained, and that combination forms the script that drives Trump. I don't see why people imagine that Trump's exceptional. He isn't. He's unusual in the violence with which he speaks, the cognitive disabilities he exhibits, the endless repetition, the lies, all that makes him slightly unusual. What makes him fundamentally the same is that he is an empire builder, an empire expansionist, and there's nothing new in that. Although, as I've just suggested, there is a faction in Russian policymaking. Kirill Dmitriev's one of them, but the Central Bank of Russia and its governor, Elvira Nabiullina, is another of them, that represents accommodation with the US empire and a subservient part in order to make the business as usual that they were used to. Dmitriev runs the RDIF, a pygmy sovereign wealth fund compared to the major sovereign wealth funds of the world. The biggest sovereign wealth fund of Russia is the Central Bank of Russia's reserves. And Elvira Nabiullina lost them, you might say, surrendered them when $300 billion worth of central bank reserves were confiscated and seized and frozen, so-called, at the beginning of the special military operation. She's responsible for surrendering and losing control over Russia's sovereign wealth. And she, as much as Dmitriev, is part of the faction that wants to negotiate a capital arrangement with Trump. This is the group that's tried to lose the war on the Ukraine battlefield. The group that's trying to win the war and is winning the war on the Ukraine battlefield is the Russian army. In Russian politics, very simple equation that supports President Putin's highly stable 85% public approval rating. It's the Russian army plus real income. If the Russian army is winning and real income is growing. Russian voters support President Putin. If the Russian army is hobbled, defeated, undermined, betrayed, if the real income of the country is falling for consumers, then the popularity of the president will decline. Fortunately, we're not in that position now, but the central bank governor has done everything possible in raising the central bank's key interest rate as high as 21%, currently at 16%, to suppress internal economic growth. And so we have a combination of factors in Moscow that cause contradictions between, public statements and contradictions between what's said that Russia wants to do in the rest of the world and what, in fact, Russia's capability to do is. Now, in the last few hours, readers in Moscow have seen the Moscow security analysis platform Vzhlyad produce an article which is the most explicit endorsement I've seen in recent days of the need for Russian military force to defend its tanker force, its fleets, both naval and air intervention to support the Russian flag or Russian registered or Russian cargo carrying fleet. Vzhlyad has come out in favor of Russian military intervention in the war at sea. If that's the case, and it's not yet Russian policy by any means, it's certainly not foreign ministry policy yet, and it's not Kremlin policy yet. If that's the policy, then Russia will be more proactive with respect to Greenland. But for the time being, just to keep my answer a bit shorter, as Foreign Minister Lavrov said a few hours ago, Russia's content to sit back and watch what it thinks is the division of Europe against Trump on the issue of Greenland. And if Foreign Minister Lavrov thinks Russia's going to benefit strategically from that division, he's kidding. I don't think he's kidding himself.
John, you mentioned a couple of things I want to dig down a little bit deeper on. You mentioned Dmitriev, who's Russia's, I guess what you want, an economic representative, meeting with Witkoff and Kushner. And I want to ask you about those meetings, because it's been portrayed as these guys are there trying to negotiate with President Putin, supposedly to end the conflict in Ukraine. Neither of those two guys are diplomats. They're real estate developers. They're investors. I have to believe these guys are just trying to tempt Putin with, look, if we can end this thing in Ukraine, we can make some huge deals that's going to benefit you and the United States in your rare earth minerals, gas and oil, whatever. Now, I want your thinking on that. They're meeting right now in Davos. Do you seriously believe that this Dmitriev is negotiating with these guys from a diplomatic point of view, like Lavrov would? Are they representing Russia in terms of diplomatic efforts to end the conflict in Ukraine? What are your thoughts on that? Because I've never believed that those two guys were at all concerned with ending the conflict, except to be able to make deals and to tempt Putin. What are your thoughts?
Well, as I've said, I think I just said, Kirill Dmitriev is the head of a pygmy fund. Pygmies don't negotiate terms, let alone dictate them, to giants. The Russian army in the Ukraine war settlement is the giant. And it's winning on the battlefield. Slowly, yes. With restrictions, yes. With electric war campaign designed to persuade Kiev to come to terms, if not to capitulate. That's the giant in this particular room. Witkoff and Kushner represent Donald Trump's personal pocket. They are bag men. And it's the calculation, it's been the calculation on the Russian side, then essentially it can lure or bribe the Trump group, his family members, and himself with enough money, it's billions of dollars worth of so-called business, to accept the Russian giant on the battlefield. Pygmies don't dictate terms to giants. However, the idea, and it's not an original idea, on the Russian side is that it can bribe the president. And this was attempted back in 2008 when President Putin, Oleg Deripaska, the aluminium and automobile oligarch, German Gref of Sberbank, and the Germans came up with a plan for Russia to acquire the Opel car division, the German part of General Motors. At the time, General Motors was bankrupt. At the time, the Clinton administration and Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State were negotiating with Germany, with Chancellor Merkel, for the sell-off of parts of the GM empire. And Opel was to become a partnership of Germany and Russia to develop a German-Russian car giant, which would have had very interesting, important, and valuable consequences for Russia in the European and global car market. A bribe was paid through Deripaska to the Clinton family. I've told the story in several ways, first in reports and then in the book, The Man Who Knew Too Much About Russia. The bribe was paid. Hillary Clinton and the family accepted the bribe. Clinton signaled that the administration at the time was ready to accept the deal that Chancellor Merkel, President Putin had worked out for the Russian-German acquisition of Opel. But then Clinton reneged on the bribe and reversed her approval and blocked Russian acquisition with Germany of the Opel car division. Putin was furious, and never trusted Hillary Clinton again for obvious reasons. Pay the bribe, meet your obligation, meet your promise. But Hillary Clinton didn't, and Opel remained within the GM system. That's happened before. So why do we find now President Putin is persuaded by the people like Dmitriev that a bribe will effectively exploit President Trump's readiness to, quote, do business with President Putin? Is there any confidence at all that you can negotiate with the United States with a president bribed? I don't know why there is that confidence now, but it's a significant political force driving the present negotiation that Dmitriev's having with Witkoff and Kushner. And it's been underway. The confidence that Trump represents an opportunity to negotiate with that the Biden administration didn't present. It's been underway since January of last year, as we all know. I've just done a Dances with Bears piece based on quoting and analyzing the texts of President Putin's telephone conversations and meetings with George W. Bush in the period from 2001 to 2003. So everybody who wants to can now read exactly what President Putin was saying privately to President Bush. And what you can then do is compare what he said then with what is going on now. And it raises a number of serious questions. is the same approach being made to the President of the United States by the Russian government? And is the same outcome likely? The American side makes certain undertakings privately and verbally, but doesn't do what it promises to do. The Russian side makes concessions and gets nothing in return. The Russian side sees opportunity in personal relations with the president, and those opportunities are always interpreted on the US side as Russian vulnerability, Russian weakness. Don't we have those conditions now? I believe we do. When does the Russian confidence in President Trump's opportunity to talk run out? When does Russian confidence cease to apply? Well, the moment is when the Russian side says that the understandings of Alaska were understandings President Putin had, but Trump never had at all. The Russian side says that understandings of Alaska were a figment of Russian imagination and were not real. That's when we get to the reality of the way in which Trump is doing business. I'm sorry if that's a little extended in answering your question. What have I left out, Regis, that you asked me that I didn't answer?
No, I've always believed that Kushner and Witkoff and this Dmitriev, and I guess Dmitriev supposedly has Putin's confidence. I don't know, but he's the guy that's out there trying to make these deals. Whether or not there's bribes or not, I never knew that, John. I didn't know about, the Clintons and what they did with Putin over the purchase of Opel. But John, I'm scratching my head. I'm going, hasn't Putin realized by now, he's a student of history. He knows that the United States is agreement incapable. I don't know if he said it, but Lavrov, but it's certainly been said from the Russian side that the United States cannot be trusted. One other thing, there's a couple of other things. Russia really hasn't done anything with one or two of its ships being pirated by Donald Trump's Navy and Coast Guard. I was wondering, well, what was going on? Is Russia sitting back and saying, okay, we took this one to this side of the face, but we're not going to go to a World War III over this yet. And then, Dimitri, one other thing. I don't know if the attack on Putin's villa residence was an attack on his life. People have debated that over and over and over again. I have no idea. But if there's a thread of truth to that, Putin, by now, hopefully realizes he's up against an enormous enemy who not only can't be trusted, but maybe was trying to take him out. I mean, what are your thoughts on? I mean, I'm concerned how Russia is responding to what we've been talking about, John.
Well, as you know, in Crimea, there, and as we've discussed before, just in Moscow, Russians ask themselves the same questions, and they give different answers. The support for President Putin is high and stable, so long as it runs in parallel with support for the Russian army and support for the economic future of everyone. And that's why I've said 85% for President Putin's job performance approval rating is a combination of Russian army victory on the battlefield plus real income growth in the economy, partly directed by Governor Nabil of the central bank. change one of the values of those variables, and you've got a decline, a serious political crisis at home. And it's the belief and commitment of the United States and the European allies that they can apply the pressure on the Ukrainian battlefield and on the Russian economy to change the value of those variables, change the level of support internally for Putin's government, and affect regime change. That's their calculation. Number two, their calculation is that by demonstrating President Putin's vulnerability to Ukrainian drone attack, it's not just a Ukrainian drone attack, it was targeted, maneuvered by US intelligence, both satellite, fixed wing and drone surveillance and so forth, and electronic intelligence. That was a US-Ukrainian operation, and it demonstrated and was intended to demonstrate that the US and the Ukraine and the European allies know where President Putin puts his head on the pillow to sleep at night. It's intended to show vulnerability. Whether it was intended to break through and actually hit and kill him in his residence it is a matter that we don't exactly know. And the Russian side has not informed us where President Putin was that particular night. It shouldn't do so, but it does know internally whether the United States assisted in identifying exactly where the president was at the moment that the drones launched an hour or so before from Ukrainian territory would strike. So whether it was targeted on President Putin's person or on the nuclear command control bunker, the so-called military facility in the same compound, is somewhat beside the point. The point being made is that President Putin is vulnerable when he is going to bed. And that vulnerability is part of the regime change part of the US-Ukrainian European war that continues. Now, that has to be combated. And the question then becomes, what's been President Putin's response? That then goes to the General Staff strike, using the Oreshnik for the second time, but only one of them, with warheads that were not armed with explosive, against one or two targets. The first target identified was the European and Ukrainian gas storage facility underground at Stry. All this is near Lvov in western Ukraine near the Polish border. Subsequently, several days later, the Russian Foreign Ministry has said, no, the target for the Oreshnik attack was an aviation repair plant. Whether there was a NATO command bunker under the plant is not said. The Russian side knows what it was shooting at. We know that there was one Oreshnik. We are told that it was the retaliation for the attack on the Novgorod residency. However, there was only one Oreshnik, one, and it produced what kind of effect does it produce on the Ukrainian side? What kind of impact did it have on US and European readiness to continue the war? I'd say the answer is zero. So then this question comes up. Yes, President Putin has lifted his restrictions on the General Staff's ability to pursue the electric war, something we've been talking about for the last 3-4 years. That's a tax on the power generating, power distribution, electricity circulation facilities and resources of the Ukraine that supports their ability to continue fighting. The electric war now is in almost full escalation, but is it stopping the war? Is it reducing the capacity of the Ukrainian, European, and US leadership to continue the war against Russia? The answer, regrettably, is no, not yet. So what's the Russian strategic calculation here? And what's the adversaries' reply. If the electric war campaign and if the use of the Oreshnik failed to stop the other side from wanting to pursue and believing they can pursue the war against Russia, both from external sources and from internal regime change methods, if that's what's happening, what must Russia do to bring the war to an end on its terms? Is the electric war failing because, and it's an important point to make, the Zelensky regime, backed by the Europeans and the United States, have demonstrated the readiness to sacrifice very large numbers of men on the front every day in their continuing war in eastern Ukraine against New Russia, against hinterland Russia. Now, if the Zelensky regime and its allies are prepared to sacrifice the manpower, the equipment, the material, the money on the land war, aren't they prepared? Are they prepared to sacrifice the home comforts of electricity, sewage, and so forth in Kiev, Lvov, and in Western Ukraine? Is there a point at which the Ukrainian alliance here will capitulate or not? Well, in my judgment, what we're seeing right now is that the Zelensky regime and its allies are prepared to sacrifice their own electricity and heating, the comforts of the home folks, if you like, the operations of their major cities, starting with Kiev. They're prepared to sacrifice even that in the conviction that if they can continue to fight Russia, Russia can be defeated. That's their conviction. That's what they say. And in fact, that's what they're doing. So Russian strategy operationally has been to bring to capitulation or bring to agreement short of capitulation the adversary side, divide the Europeans from the Americans, cut off US intelligence sharing, weapons supplies, and so forth to the regime so that the war can be stopped by that method. Well, the method's not working. The method isn't working. The negotiated record with the Trump administration, whether we're talking about Trump himself at Anchorage, Alaska, Marco Rubio's State Department, Hegseth's Ministry of Defense or Ministry of War, Pentagon, none of these agencies have shown any real indication that they are ending the war against Russia's long-term security. They're arguing with the Europeans and with Zelensky over terms to continue this war. And the methods for retaliation, the so-called symmetrical tit-for-tat, retaliation for the attack on the Novgorod residents, and so on. These methods aren't having the desired strategic and operational effect. Since that's the case, what next? Now, you also raised, Regis, the issue of the naval war, the piracy war, the attacks on the tankers. At the time of the last pursuit of the Marinera tanker, the Mariner tanker, formerly the Bella One, from off the Venezuelan shore to the North Atlantic, the Russian side agreed to reflag the vessel as a Russian-registered, Russian-flagged vessel. It was empty of cargo. It wasn't carrying oil so far as I know, even though President Trump said it was being emptied and unloaded of oil. When the Marinera was sailing under the reflagging, the Ministry of Transport of Russia agreed, presumably in coordination with the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry, to defend the flag. That's why it was reflagged. The foreign ministry then attempted to negotiate with the State Department and perhaps with the White House that the vessel was now Russian and would be defended and should not be challenged by the United States. The foreign ministry made a number of statements to that effect. Trump decided instead to practice boarding the tanker at a British base in northern Scotland, and with British help, they came up with an operation to intercept the tanker, drop special forces onto the tanker, seize control of it, and take the tanker. And they did that, as Trump announced, under the eyes of a Russian submarine and a Russian naval vessel. I believe it was a corvette. Trump said it was a destroyer. Trump also spat in Putin's face by saying, when we showed up, the Russian vessels sailed away, ran away. In other words, he was saying, we preempted you. We acted faster than you could. We were not impressed by your show of military support for your flag. We were not deterred. We've taken the tanker on the basis, the trumped up basis, legal basis that they offered in the North Atlantic off Scotland as the vessel was heading eastward. Now, what did the Russian Foreign Ministry then say? First, that they looked to the United States to ensure the security of the crew, especially the two Russians on board. And by the way, the rest of the crew were principally Indian nationals, a strategic ally of Russia, Ukrainians, a strategic ally of the United States, and a couple of Georgians, also friendly to the United States. But the Russian side said only, we want you to secure the release of our citizens on board the vessel. And then when the US announced that the two Russians would be let go, Sergei Lavrov's spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, announced her thanks to the United States authorities for releasing the crew, the Russian members of the crew, not all of the crew. I'm not heard in the history of piracy that the victim of the pirates thanks the pirates for letting them go. This was unprecedented, and it was a flat contradiction to the position of the foreign ministry on the piracy of the Trump Act. And then what's happened? The Russians haven't been released. Foreign Minister Lavrov made that point a few hours ago in a speech in Moscow. So having thanked Trump for releasing them, the Russian side is embarrassed by the fact that they haven't been released. Now, what does all that add up to if you're President Trump, the Pentagon, or the State Department? It adds up to the belief that Russia's vulnerable, Russia's weak, Russia says but doesn't do. Russia is, from an American point of view, this calculation goes, a paper tiger. I think I've answered your questions here. An Oreshnik is fired in retaliation for the Novgorod residency, but it has no operational effect. Second, Russia responds to the detention, seizure, and confiscation of the Marinera vessel, thanks the US for releasing the Russians on board. That doesn't happen. Russia doesn't respond. The only response I've seen, as I've mentioned a few minutes back, is Vzglyad, which is a Kremlin-supported security platform, media platform in Moscow, has announced or has said in a piece written today, published today, that the Russian Navy and the Russian Air Force can have the capacity for intervening to protect the fleets. Well, not so far. It's demonstrated the reverse, the opposite. And that invites escalation on the other side. And when you're at war, that means you've conceded your escalation control. The other side will dictate escalation dominance on you, at you, under you, in every direction they think they can. And they will do to Russia what the US and Israel thought they were doing last year when they attacked Iran. And when that failed, they proceeded to regime change operations, which we've just seen the Iranians have defeated in Iran over the last couple of weeks. That's what's coming for Russia, because that's the way the Trump administration functions.
John, I have to agree with you. I am convinced that the United States and their vassals in Europe perceive Russia's patience, if we want to call it that, as weakness. How many red lines have they crossed? They see that as, okay, nothing happened. We're going to escalate further. So I think you're exactly right. I'm always wondering where China fits into this. You know, Russia and China have very strong relations, strategic relations. I don't think they have a mutual defense treaty. I'm not sure, you could correct me. But China's sitting back there knowing that the United States and Trump has declared China the number one enemy. I mean, they can say competitor, but everybody knows, you know, the language has been enemy for a long time. And it's because China has surpassed the United States in terms of its economy, in terms of its industrial capacity. The United States lost that a long time ago. So, John, how does China fit into this? Now, they're depending on most of their oil coming by ship. And they were buying a lot of this crude from Venezuela. So you have China and Russia both being attacked simultaneously and threatened by Donald Trump. How do you see China and Russia responding, together or independently?
Well, just a couple of factual differences. It's a relatively small proportion of Chinese crude oil imports that have come from Venezuela. I think somewhat less than 10%. It goes up and down. It has gone up and down depending on the price of the oil, being advantageous to the Chinese refineries to buy. A relatively small amount, but a very big investment of Chinese capital in Venezuela has been put at risk because China, I believe, has more than $20 billion worth of investment in Venezuela in concessions that Trump now proposes to take for US companies. So it's a much bigger Chinese investment stake in Venezuela than the Russian investment stake. But both countries have done very little to deter the US attack as it was being planned. And while complaining at the violation of international law, the kidnapping of President Maduro, the fact is that China and Russia seek to make an accommodation with the successor presidency of Delcy Rodriguez and will endeavor to preserve their assets in Venezuela without deterring the Trump administration from pursuing its line, also with the Rodriguez administration. So something similar has occurred with the Chinese and Russian support for Iran. The Chinese make statements, but are not prepared to use their economic weapons to deter the United States, except from direct US attacks on direct Chinese economic commercial interests. There's no sign that the Chinese military capability, much advertised in military parades, as we saw last year, that the Chinese military capability is in a position to fight anywhere, anytime, any enemy. The Chinese have no military capacity that's experienced in fighting and winning wars. The demonstration effect of Chinese behavior, talk but don't fight, is also understood in the West as a paper tiger. Chinese economic muscle, which was used very effectively against the Trump administration, persuasively, as a deterrent, has not been used to support Chinese allies, neither Russia nor Venezuela nor Iran, not yet. And the Chinese approach, even in words, has been far less convincing that they mean to defend their commercial sources, their allies. As for Russia-Chinese alliance, it's yet to be tested. It's yet to be tested. Let's leave it politely like that.
Wow. John, I've been wondering, Russia and China are very much involved in the BRICS. And it's pretty well known many of these countries are trading with each other in their own currencies and even in the yuan. And I've been reading some analysis that's making the argument that because of Trump's behavior over the last year, everything he's been doing that we've been talking about is forcing the BRICS movement to be accelerated as not just a nice idea, but now as a defense mechanism to destroy the dollar. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a realistic conclusion that Russia, China, India, South America, Brazil, and a number of other nations that are now members of BRICS and want to be, do you think they are restraining themselves not to further escalate, but to wait out the economic collapse of the United States? What are your thoughts?
Well, I understand a lot of US podcasters want to paint the BRICS as a serious alliance in the battle against the US dollar, in the battle for international trade, and in the war against the sanctions war against Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. I understand the wishful thinking, I understand the exaggeration, and I understand that there's genuine hopefulness that an alliance of BRICS can, with time and effort and capital and military capacity, pose the kind of deterrent effects that would restrain US, European, and NATO action. For the time being, that isn't happening. Instead, what you see is US, European efforts to split the BRICS, to divide Brazil from Venezuela, to mobilize Pakistan against both Iran and India. And here's Dimitri. So why don't I stop talking immediately and let you bring Dimitri up to scratch or up to where we are, and let him participate now, because I've said too much.
Dimitri, welcome. And I have to apologize. I made a real serious miscalculation about the time difference between Moscow and the East Coast, and I really should have known better. What we've been talking about mostly in the last several minutes is that the United States under Donald Trump has been increasing the pressure on Russia and China. But we've been talking mostly about Russia. And I know you and John have talked about this, that the United States and Donald Trump believes that Putin and Russia is weak because they don't respond forcefully. They take a punch and they just say, okay, that hurt a little bit, but we don't want to escalate. I was asking John if Russia has any realistic response other than just being patient and waiting out for the collapse of the United States economy, which the BRICS movement seems to be accelerating. Your thoughts?
That's a very difficult question to answer because there's so much information we don't have about things like the rate at which the Russian military-industrial complex is able to build weaponry. We can make educated guesses, but we don't know. The Russian Federation doesn't, for obvious reasons, give us all of the details of these things. There are things about the Russian economy we don't know. There are things about Russia's intelligence gathering capabilities we don't know. So it's really difficult to answer that question. All of these things and many other factors, I think, enter into a consideration of your question. But I think it is fair to say that there is at least one way in which Russia and the world at large can do more, and that is to unite in opposition to U.S. hegemony. And we saw a little indication of something like this when Mark Carney, whom I refer to as Prime Minister Goldman Sachs, went to China recently. And I think that Trump has become so aggressive. He's actually doing, in many ways, the hard work for the governments of Russia and China because he's alienating his allies to such an extraordinary degree that I think maybe some people in the Western political and economic elite are starting to ask themselves the question, maybe we bet on the wrong horse and we should have aligned ourselves with BRICS. So if there comes a point in time, I think we're a long way away, by the way, before these people wake up and smell the coffee, which is to say that they understand that the interests of their countries and the interests of the peoples they represent would be best served by aligning themselves with BRICS. We're a long way away from that. But if Trump continues to go down this path of extraordinary and limited aggression and utter disrespect, abject contempt for the interests of other so-called allies of the United States, we may see a bigger move towards consolidating opposition to the United States project of global hegemony. If the major countries of the world, including the bigger European states, were to unite in opposition to Trump's agenda, then you could really see some major progress in that regard. But as long as China and Russia are having to do the heavy lifting alone, there are going to be limits on what they can do.
Dimitri, you mentioned Trump alienating even his friends, his allies, Canada and the European Union. I'm just reading today that Macron, Starmer, Merz, and some others are saying we need to reestablish relations with Russia. And this comes about as a result of what Trump is doing and threatening them if they oppose him on taking Greenland. Dimitri, will give you a chance to respond to that first. I see the EU and NATO beginning to crack. What are your thoughts?
Well, if they're actually thinking rationally, the leaders of these European NATO members, they would begin to move decisively in the direction of dismantling NATO and realigning their priorities as towards the BRICS. But I'm deeply suspicious of all of these people. So we'll have to see. Like, for example, a lot of people are saying that Mark Carney's trip to China was a game changer. But when you actually read the fine print of the agreements he struck with the Chinese government, they're extremely limited. Really modest improvement in the terms of trade between Canada and China. I don't even know why they called it a strategic partnership. It doesn't bear the slightest resemblance to a strategic partnership. So, and I even go so far as to, maybe I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I even go so far as to ask myself whether Trump told Carney to go to China because he wants Carney to be a kind of Trojan horse for the U.S. government. Sheer speculation on my part, but I entertain all possibilities when it comes to these people. So, I would say, show me the money. When we see real dramatic changes in terms of European and Canadian attitudes towards the United States and the BRICS, then I'll believe it. Until then, I remain skeptical. But I do think that Carney's trip to China is a positive sign.
John?
I'd like to endorse what Dimitri just said. The point is, show me the money. I mean, let's be clear. What realism in politics means is money, votes, and bullets. Money, votes, and bullets. Now, if we use money as a measure of what's realism and not some freshman lecture from the University of Chicago on the realism of division of spheres of influence in Europe and the rest of the world. If we look at the way money's talking, I did a couple of things to prepare for this. In the first place, the German aerospace and defense stock market index, which the FT produces each day, has seen phenomenal growth as the money in Germany and the money in Europe has been betting on long-term profit making from war with Russia. And the index has jumped to a peak. I'm just looking down at my papers between December 29 and January 13. The German Aerospace Defense Index, that's compiling all the aerospace and defense businesses, shareholding listed businesses of Germany, jumped 17% to reach a peak of the index on January 13. On January 13, the peak that the index has reached over the last several years since the war with Russia began in 2022, that index peaked and it dropped a couple of percent. It's now turned from January 13 to now, 7 days, by 3%. So when you look at the money, the question Dimitri just asked is a good one. Has the German defense profit sector, the German military industrial complex, begun to suspect that war with Russia might not be so profitable? Is there a 3% loss of confidence they can continue to profit from the war with Russia compared to the 17% gain of confidence they had between Christmas and January 13? Those numbers don't tell you definitively, categorically, so that we can express confidence and our audience can go home feeling comfortable that the Germans are reassessing their position. And that answers partly the question of, can Germany, France, the UK, Italy, the principal countries are left in Europe, allied to the United States, can we expect their voters to move against Russia? Their voters to move against Russia in the way that might be a harbinger in the stock market index? Well, the answer there is a bit of a complicated one, isn't it? First, we know that nobody can get more unpopular in France politically than President Macron, but he continues to dominate the policy making of that country by executive decree. He's ruling essentially without parliamentary opposition, much as Trump is ruling. But Macron's public voter support's minuscule. Starmer's is also hitting the toilet level. In Germany, Merz started as a 28% mandate for his party and him to rule Germany. But in these countries, a combination of propaganda and repression, and it's obvious in Greece, more obvious in Greece because Greek public opinion is much more against the war with Russia than anyone else in Europe, and yet the regime is committed to war with Russia. And combination of propaganda, repression, and simply ignoring Parliament works on voters. So what's left? What do we face? The answer is that I think that Europe, there has been a regrettable exaggeration of the division between the Europeans and the Americans. And let's leave my remarks with Foreign Minister Lavrov. Foreign Minister Lavrov dismissed Macron's offer to resume talks with Putin as PR, publicity seeking, attempts to pacify domestic opinion without any real inclination to change the line, as Dimitri said, either happens or it doesn't happen. And in my view, it's then the third element of realism in politics. If money's ambiguous and votes can be repressed, what's left? It's bullets. Bullets are essentially the power of Russian force to dictate on the Ukrainian battlefield such a defeat that is deterrent for the opening of the Arctic battlefield, the Polish battlefield, the Kaliningrad battlefield, and so forth and so on. If bullets don't work, I'll be surprised. But they are not being deployed, not in the war against the sea, not on the Arctic route yet. So that's the way I see it at the moment.
Dimitri?
Could you remind me of the question? Because I was listening to John carefully and I lost track of the question.
Forget the question. Just in terms of what John said, are we at the stage where the only response that the rest of the world has left is bullets? You know, it was money, it was votes and bullets. Is that where we're at? And given Trump's recklessness, and nobody has given him a punch in the face yet, are bullets the only thing that can stop this guy?
Well, I think Russia has answered that question definitively, yes. Russia has decided to opt for bullets. You know, in 2022, they decided, after making multiple and extraordinary efforts and perhaps going too far in terms of their patience with the United States, that military action was the only alternative. And so they went to war against NATO. And that's what's been happening ever since. There's been a war between the Russian Federation and NATO. Now, whether the rest of the world will join them in that regard, whether that China will have to take that step or others, I think really depends on the level of unity globally in opposition to Trump's mind-blowingly aggressive behavior. I think there is an economic answer to American aggression. But the economic answer will require a high degree of unity. So, for example, if all of the significant economies in Europe joined with the BRICS in sanctioning the United States, they could put a real hurt on the United States. Now, this would be, extraordinarily damaging to the global economy, but it's better than a World War III. So, and I think that's the grim choice confronting the world today. Either they join collectively to impose a severe economic penalty on the United States for its behavior, or certain great powers like China and Russia will have to take matters into their own hands militarily in order to defend their own sovereignty. So I would hope, I can't stress this enough, that other significant economies around the world, the leaders of those countries, will come to their senses and understand that they need to align themselves with BRICS powers in opposition to U.S. hegemony. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a full-blown Third World War. And arguably, we're already there.
One of the things that isn't being talked about, I mean, we mentioned economy, and what Dimitri, what you're saying, what the rest of the world really needs to do if they wake up is join together. But, you know, I'm an American living here in Russia, and so I'm very much attuned to what's going on in the United States. You live part-time in Montreal. You spent a lot of time, your career in the United States. What I'm reading and trying to analyze that hardly anybody's talking about in the blogosphere is what's happening to the United States economy. $38 trillion in debt, going into an additional $1 trillion, like I think every 6 months. They're barely paying off the interest on that. The household debt, individual household debt is at $18 trillion. Included in that is the student debt that the government refuses to forgive. And what's happening globally, I think, from what I'm reading, is the dollar is losing its value and its credibility. The Russian ruble actually has been performing very well. You look at what's happening with who's buying gold and silver, and it's Russia, it's China, it's India, and it's a number of other countries that are stockpiling gold, which to a lot of people is a hedge against the collapse of the United States dollar. I personally am of the belief, I'm not an economist, but there's an awful lot of economists that are predicting this. The United States is quite likely going to collapse under its own weight. Dimitri, I'll start with you first and then go to John. Do you think it's possible that the hegemon, because it is so overextended all over the world, and because it's falling apart internally, economically, socially, as we're seeing right now across the country, is that collapse very likely, in your opinion, Dimitri?
If we continue down this current path, it's inevitable. When it'll happen is anybody's guess. But in the foreseeable future, I think it's inevitable if the United States continues to pursue the policies that it's currently pursuing. And, you know, I just watched while waiting to join you for this call, I was watching a surprise press conference from Donald Trump. And in the it was always a painful experience, by the way, but in the Q&A, he was asked, because the ostensible purpose of the press conference was to celebrate the achievements of the Trump regime during his the first year of his second term. So he spent a long time reading off a script, the laundry list of so-called achievements, 90% of which was utter bullshit. And then he started taking questions. And one of the questions was, one of the few questions was, you know, you keep saying how wonderful the American economy is. What do you say to people out there who are struggling to make ends meet? And he gave it almost verbatim the same answer that the Democrats gave under Biden, which is Americans don't understand how well they're getting the wrong sources of information. They're being deceived by, you know, disinformation artists into thinking that the economy is actually performing very bad, but it's actually doing well. What these idiots don't understand, neither the idiots who are running the Democratic Party or the Republicans, is that, I mean, it's one thing to lie to people about what's happening in Iran or what's happening in Russia or what's happening in China. You know, 90% of Americans will never actually know from personal experience, but you can't really lie to them about their grocery bill. You look at the store and you see, my God, the price of my groceries went up by 5% over the last few months. You know, or your electricity bill. The cost of electricity is soaring in the United States in part because of the demand of these data centers. You know, so people in the United States can feel their quality of life diminishing, and eventually there is going to be hell to pay for this. And I think that you may see that in the midterm elections that are coming up. So quite apart from these larger macroeconomic issues, and then there's the AI bubble, which you didn't. I didn't hear you mention that.
We didn't.
I think that is a huge problem for the United States. A massive proportion of its so-called GDP growth is coming from investment in AI, which is probably never going to achieve its full potential or come anywhere close to doing that, at least the potential it's claimed to have by the leaders of the industry. I think it only takes one severe economic shock to bring that bubble that whole edifice crashing down. So, for example, an attack on Iran and the closure of the Hormuz Straits. That could be an economic shock that causes the bubble in the United States to burst. And when it comes, it could be far worse than what we experienced in 2008, 2009. We're talking about a far bigger bubble, far greater fragility in Western economies. So, I always like to stress, from my perspective, the greatest threats to U.S. hegemony are not external; they're internal.
Internal. I agree with you.
I think,
John, go ahead, John.
Let me just run past you some supporting data on votes, supporting what Dimitri's just said. I'm looking down at my the realclearpolitics.com regular daily review of President Trump's job approvals. Okay, and what we can see is that the negative spread, the refusal of Americans to believe that Trump has captured any gain on inflation. The negative spread I'm looking at, to get my numbers correct, is 20.3, minus 20.3. The disapproval of Trump on domestic inflation in the United States is very high. And it's one of the reasons his job approval rating overall is now worsening. So think of this in political terms as well as economic terms, in the way the White House functions, which is standard for all presidential politics. And then I think I'd like to put in what's unusual about this White House. Between January 7 and January 18, so the last few days, President Trump's disapproval overall has increased. So neither the operation against President Maduro and the Caracas attack, nor anything else he's done in the last 2 weeks has improved his public approval, his job approval among US voters. And the perception of worsening inflation has, as it were, accelerated the disapproval. Okay, that's the first thing. And certainly that leads to the belief that he may, in fact, suffer a significant loss of control in the Congress in the midterms. Okay, on immigration, he's still negative. Nothing he's doing with ICE is increasing US voter support for his policies on so-called illegal immigration. The one positive in the job approval breakdown of it is plus 1% approval of Trump's handling of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On that one, he gets plus 1 support. On Russia-Ukraine, he gets minus 20 percentage points. That's an indication that somehow or other, for some reason or other, US voters are persuaded, particularly Democrats, that the genocide in Gaza, covered now by the BOP, the Board of Peace, has been a genuine improvement on Trump's side for US voter approval. Otherwise, everything's negative. Now, we can discuss what that really means later if we have time. But the one thing that's really unusual about presidential White House calculation this time round, unlike anything I've ever seen, is the readiness to use domestic force to repress. And that's where we began with Regis. The use of ICE in Minneapolis, the use of National Guard in Los Angeles, Portland, Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. This is a signal of the readiness of the Trump administration, driven principally by Stephen Miller at the White House, to use fascist methods when Democratic voting fails to maintain its support of Trump. So several questions arise, and you by all means follow with your analysis of what's happening in Minnesota. The prospect that the Trump administration will reach for fascist methods, having failed to put a serious dent in the domestic votes against Trump in Los Angeles, in Portland, where troops have been withdrawn, and so on. What will they do next that they might try that's never been tried before? Might they cancel the midterm elections on the basis of some theory or purported legal idea of insurrection or domestic emergency? Is that possible? Well, you would have dismissed this as a US voter for the last umpteen years, but now with the likes of Miller advising Trump, and Miller wants the national security advisor's job that Rubio has. Just watch Miller's ambition grow as the violent methods he espouses are put into effect using new US forces. ICE is a new US police military force. It's not a brown shirt operation. It's a black shirt operation. Now, is the US heading for that kind of fascist showdown, a crystal night come the midterms later this year? That question can now be asked realistically, not in an exaggerated way. And I'd like to hear what both of you think of that possibility.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And, we started out talking about Minnesota, and I've got 3 former classmates that are living there. They're personally involved, and they actually believe that Trump is going to use this as a reason for declaring martial law. And they said that he's already stated who needs midterm elections. And so this kind of confrontation with the American people, and it's not just going to happen in Minnesota. My son, who's a former military Green Beret and all of that, he said, Dad, there are more guns in America than there are people. And he was telling me he and others have been accumulating military grade weapons, firearms, bullets, whatever, gas, flashlights, batteries, food, etc., because he and others, former military, believe that this confrontation is very close now. He supported Trump in the beginning, make America great again, but because of Trump's behavior, he and others are turning away from it. Dimitri, you're close to it. You're right up there across the border, a couple hours drive from where I was born in Maine. What are your thoughts on, this is, to me, is fascism. There's no other way to describe it.
Look, I think Trump is, whether wittingly or unwittingly, sending a message to the whole world that he does not consider himself bound by any law. He does not consider himself bound by the Constitution. He doesn't consider himself bound by decorum, the principles, established practices of diplomacy. He does not consider him, just to give you a little example, publishing the private sycophantic texts of Macron and Mark Rutte, which he did today, writing a letter to the leader of Norway and saying, part of the reason why I'm going to confiscate Greenland is because I wasn't given the Nobel Peace Prize. Literally, and he gave an interview, I'm sure, as you both know, where he said the limits of my power are my own conscience, which he doesn't possess. He has no conscience. So why would anybody discount the possibility that this man will cancel the midterms?
Yeah.
It's entirely, I was actually coming into my building the other day and I met a neighbor of mine who's not prone to, conspiracy theories. And we started chatting about Trump. And he said, I think he's going to cancel the midterms. I was surprised that somebody like him, he's a level-headed person, not an alarmist, that he said this. but I think he's entirely right to have that concern. Anything is possible with this man. And let's be very clear, Trump is a front man. I think we
Yes.
need to be very, he's just a front man. And if the oligarchy did not want Trump to pursue these policies, Trump would not pursue these policies. And if they needed to rid themselves of him, they would do so by hook or by crook. He represents the agenda of the oligarchy. And the oligarchy is hell-bent on destroying what remains of American democracy.
I'm not concerned about the time constraint here in the show because it's been really fascinating. And but I want to jump to and finish on this note because, you know, we could continue forever and we will continue the discussions about what Trump is doing going forward if he's allowed to, if somebody doesn't punch him out. I found this last point to be like unbelievable. Trump has set up this board of peace for the Middle East, for Gaza, where he's the chairperson. And he said there's an entry fee of $1 billion. I read that somewhere. I don't know if it's true, but he invited Putin to be on the board. And John and I were talking about, you know, Putin in relationship to Trump and, you know, Russia in relationship to the United States and everything that's going on. I mean, would Putin really accept this? And the last thing is, you know, Dimitri, you're an attorney. John is very schooled in the law and geopolitical issues. Trump basically has just replaced international law and the United Nations by setting himself up as in his board as the chief peacekeepers for Gaza. Dimitri, you first and then John.
I would be shocked if Vladimir Putin would join this travesty. You know, I've been critical of the Russian and Chinese governments for not vetoing that disgraceful resolution, but whether that was a sensible thing for them to do or not, I don't think that either the Russian president or Xi Jinping have any interest on being in this farce of a board, whatever you call it. I did see a report just in the last few hours, however, that the Belarusian president was going to join the peace board, which I suspect, I doubt he would have done that without consulting Vladimir Putin. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if, you know, Vladimir Putin urged him to do so, because that gives Russia a way to at least exercise some kind of influence or be aware of what's going on internally at the peace board without the extraordinary political cost of actually being on it. You know, I mean, if Vladimir Putin were to be on it, not only would he diminish his standing amongst many people in the global south, but he also would be putting himself in a situation where he would be outnumbered. The vast majority of people on that board are vassals of the United States. They will do whatever the United States wants, and he's going to be associated with whatever decisions are shoved down his throat. I think he's far too intelligent to participate in that travesty, but I think maybe the plan B was to have Lukashenko take part instead.
John?
It's important points that Dimitri's just made. Let me go back to the disclosures of President Putin's conversations with George Bush 25 years ago, in which he privately says that the real meaning of terrorism in the world is not religion, but rather it's a contest or a fight between Islamic capital and Jewish capital. If you go to the Dances with Bears, the last piece, you'll see the full text and you can read exactly what Putin was saying and what Bush was replying. By Jewish capital, Putin was meaning the combination of the United States and Israel. Nothing more clearly demonstrates 25 years later what Jewish capital means than the Israeli-US combination of genocide against the Palestinian people for the redevelopment in every respect real estate terms of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip under the BOP. Okay, I see there's a continuity there, and regrettably, there may be a continuity on President Putin's part between what he said in 2001 and what he may do in 2026. Let's be clear what's happened. More than 50 countries have been invited by Trump to sit on the BOP. They include Pakistan and India. There's hardly a significant country that hasn't been invited, but very few of them have announced that they have been invited, that they enjoy being invited, and that they are considering whether to accept the invitation. 2 countries have announced that they were invited. Dmitry Peskov announced for Russia first that Putin had been invited and was seriously considering. Then, as Dmitry just said, Alexander Lukashenko's office confirmed that he and Belarus had been invited to sit on the board. And the Belarus public press release indicated this was a sign from Trump of the new respect Trump shows and the United States shows towards Belarus. It was treated as a breakthrough for Belarus versus European sanctions, particularly Polish sanctions, against Belarus. In the same way, and for the same PR reason, you might say, Peskov announced the invitation as if it's a sign of Trump's respect. Another way of looking at it from Russian point of view is to say our primary objective is one war at a time. We want to induce Trump to support our terms of settlement for the Ukraine war. We will accept what he wants us to do in the war against the Arabs, the Palestinians, and the Muslims in the Gaza Strip. There is a significant constituency in Moscow right now which recommends that Putin should accept Trump's invitation to sit on the board. And I'm referring, there's a piece written in the last couple of hours by somebody who's been aping the Russian Foreign Ministry Kremlin line for a long time for personal reasons, that supports the idea of Putin joining the BOP. So it's not ruled out. As Dimitri said, the perception among Russian allies, particularly Iran in the Middle East, that Putin would accept to sit on the board with Trump, with Netanyahu, and others. For
Tony Blair.
And well, Tony Blair, good to mention that it was Blair's position on the board that Putin objected to when it was first raised as part of the so-called peace deal with Hamas. It was Blair only, not the principle of the board, that Putin objected to. So what to say? It's not clear what President Putin intends to do with respect to the BOP, and he is unlikely to spell it out because he doesn't spell out what Russian policy has been towards genocide of the Palestinians. So that's where we are currently, undecided, you might say indecisive, you might say vacillating, you might say temporizing, delay, while Russia watches to see what all the others in the 50 states do.
I just want to say that I'm not surprised they're saying they're seriously consider it, because if they just dismissed it out of hand, that's just going to ruffle the feathers of this extraordinarily sensitive president. So there's nothing to be gained by just saying immediately no. There may well be a debate, John. I'm in no position to. You're much better informed than I am about the internal workings of the Russian political elite. But I reiterate what I said. I think this would be a terrible mistake And I would be very surprised if at the end of all of this internal debate, Vladimir Putin would lower himself because becoming a member of this fraudulent peace board. It is nothing but a con job. It is going to end in disaster. He's going to be outnumbered. It's going to lower his standing in the global South, and in particular in the Arab and Muslim world. And I just think Russia has nothing to gain by participating through its president in this scam, especially when, you know, somebody who's closely allied to Moscow, Alexander Lukashenko, is going to be on the board. You know, that'll keep them apprised of what's actually happening without associating them with whatever travesty emerges from this scam.
Wow, this has been an incredible hour and a half. Dimitri, I'm so glad you were able to join us when you did.